Okay, you should have just watched an amazing animation video on YouTube. I would really encourage you to revisit that video and really make sure you understand what's going on. I'm such a visual learner, and I think that those visual kind of schematics and animations that they used in that video was really good. So if you need a review of that, take that video sort of step by step, pause when you need to. What we're going to go through right now is really based on that video. So if you haven't watched that YouTube video, go back and do that. So what we are going to talk about in this module are some general neuromuscular principles. So we're going to talk about skeletal muscle structure. We're also going to talk about the steps leading to muscular contraction. And muscular contraction will be our next lecture. And finally, really just reviewing this neuromuscular junction. So I say down here, given the role of skeletal muscles in determining sports performance, a thorough understanding of muscle structure and function is extremely important to exercise scientists. And so one of the recurring themes is really for me to kind of get you to think like an exercise scientist, which is something that I get to do a lot. So it's fun to be able to sort of impart some of this wisdom onto you all. So just really quickly, if you haven't had anatomy or just a quick review of anatomy, we know that the human body contains over 600 skeletal muscles, and skeletal muscles take up about 40 to 50% of a person's total body weight. And skeletal muscles perform three important functions. So force generation for movement, that one makes sense, and breathing, generation for postural support, so standing up straight, sitting up straight, and heat production during periods of cold. So skeletal muscles are attached to bones by tough connective tissues called tendons. So here I have label the missing parts of a muscle. So let's go through this really quickly. A is going to be bone. B is a tendon. C is our skeletal muscle. That's what SM stands for. D is going to be a nuclei. E is a capillary. F is our sarcolemma. G is our myofibril. H are striations. I is sarcomeres. J is going to be our actin. And K is going to be our myosin. And these are labeled here for us. So really what I wanted to do was just to kind of give you that microscopic, I guess, overview of what we're talking about. If you haven't had anatomy or if it's been a while, understand that we have a lot of anatomy going on here. And in between, or really what's kind of blowing up here, is this actin and myosin, and this is going to be really important when we get into muscular contraction. So, our neuromuscular system, how do muscles actually operate? How does this work? And this is through the neuromuscular system. So, we're breaking that down between the words neuro and muscular. So, we know that impulse starts in the brain and then travels down to our skeletal muscle to make muscles contract and to do the work, eventually generate ATP. And these are some concepts that we're really going to get into in this class. So this is directly kind of verbiage from that YouTube video that you watched. So this is a really good one to kind of go through and test yourself from that prior YouTube video. But let's go through it now. So the neuromuscular junction, each skeletal muscle is connected to a nerve fiber branch coming from a nerve cell. And these nerve cells are called motor neurons. And they extend outward from the spinal cord. The motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates is called a motor unit. The site where the motor neuron and the muscle cell meet is called the neuromuscular junction. And at this junction, the sarcolemma forms a pocket that is called the motor end plate. When a nerve impulse reaches the end of the motor nerve, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is released. And diffuses across the synaptic cleft to bind with receptor sites. So this causes an increase in the permeability of the sarcolemma to sodium, resulting in the depolarization called the end plate potential. Hopefully this is a review, but it might have been a while since you all have thought about some of these concepts. So I want to still continue to go over this muscle fiber anatomy because it's really going to be important that you understand some of these basic concepts before we talk about skeletal muscle contraction and excitation contraction coupling. So our sarcolemma, this is going to be a cell membrane. And this contains an abundance of the oxygen-binding protein myoglobin. And myofibrils are these cylindrical structures within the muscle fiber. There are two types called actin and myosin. The thin is called actin, and the thick is called myosin. So at each end of the fiber, these myofibrils are anchored to the inner surface of the sarcolemma. And so when a myofibril shortens, the muscle shortens. And so another word for skeletal muscle shortening is contraction. And the next YouTube video I have you watch following this really brings this and explains it in a more visual context. So I think it'll make it a little bit easier to understand. So another important term to remember is our sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is an elaborate, smoothed endoplasmic reticulum, and it stores calcium. So that's really the important concept to remember about the sarcoplasmic reticulum is that it stores calcium when a muscle is not contracted, but when a muscle is stimulated, we know that calcium is released into the sarcoplasm. And so this membrane has calcium pumps that function to pump calcium out of the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum after contraction. And so again, this is just sort of that microscopic view showing that the sarcoplasmic reticulum are storage sites for calcium, which plays a huge role in muscle contraction that we'll talk about in the next module. So just remember, sarcoplasmic reticulum is our storage of calcium. and that plays a really big role in muscular contraction. So the other terms that's important to introduce is the structure of myosin, which we said were our thick filaments. And so these are elongated, kind of golf club shapes. And it's amazing how the structure of these myofibrils really play into the anatomy and the function and what the human body is able to do. And so the structure of actin is also incredibly exciting because we have our G-actin molecules, we have troponin and tropomyosin. And so the actin is composed of three major proteins. So troponin is one of those. Tropomyosin. And I'm blanking on the third one. Let me follow back up with that. So two strands of this fibrous actin form a double helix, extending the length of this myofilament. And then these G-actin monomeres, these kind of yellow dots here, can bind to the myosin during muscle contraction. And so again, the anatomy and the structure of these filaments are really important when we talk about muscle contraction. So I'm kind of just giving an intro. If there's anything else that you need to look up or any questions you have, if you don't have a good sort of baseline understanding of some of these terms, just let me know. And so performance, let's bring a little bit of exercise physiology into play. So we know that performance declines with aging. So why do we become weaker as we age? So muscle loss, another term for muscle loss is sarcopenia. That's kind of your clinical word for the day. And so this can begin as early as your 30s if you're sedentary. And so genetics and lifestyle, this plays a major factor, and it really varies from person to person. And so there's several reasons why we become weaker. Age, physical activity level, genetics, all of these play a role into why our performance declines with age. And so for our next graph, I wanted to make sure that I have the right one here. Sorry, I apologize. We also can add hormones to this list. Chronic inflammation. So all of these factors kind of come together and are reasons why we become weaker as we age. And I think that this picture here really depicts what's going on with sarcopenia. The person's sort of body, I guess, is kind of the same size, but really what we're trying to show you here is the visual of how much smaller this muscle is in an aged individual versus sort of a younger or a healthier individual. So I think that this visual really kind of brings things home and really shows muscle loss and sarcopenia. Okay, so now let's bring in a little bit of sports performance and how this declines with aging. So we are going to have some examples here of, our first one is going to be blue. We're going to make this a shot put. I love graphs. I'm going to do a lot of graphs in this class. They just make me happy. Red is going to be marathon. And then green, this one's kind of random, but maybe not. Rebounds in basketball. Rebounds in b-ball. Okay, so for the shot put, let's go ahead and every time you see a graph, I really want you to orient yourself with what's going on the x-axis. So you see here that this is the age, starting from 10 to 60. Really orient yourself with a graph before you try to start figuring out what's going on. Look at the axis and try to kind of anticipate what we're going to talk about. And then we have performance, peak of performance. So the two concepts we're kind of connecting here is age and peak of sports performance. And then I'm going to give examples of the shot put, the marathon, and rebounds. So let's go ahead and start at 20 here. So let's do a shot put. Let's start at 20. Let's start our marathon here as well. And then let's do our rebounds. So those are kind of all on the same playing field. I always love to tell this fun fact. It's debatable, but 20 years of age really is kind of your physiological peak. It's actually getting a little bit later into the mid-20s, even maybe early to mid-30s, depending on the sport, depending on if it's aerobic or anaerobic, due to technological advances and just things that we know physiologically. But generally, you know, those early 20s to mid-20s, you're really kind of at your prime, but you can still continue to get better. Telling myself this as someone that is older than that. You can continue to get better throughout your young adult and adult life. So your shot put, you're actually going to be pretty stable from your peak performance until about 40, when you're really going to drop off pretty drastically. So 20 to 40 are kind of your peak years for the shot put. So for the marathon, oh, this one's really kind of cool. So the marathon, you actually can get better up until your 30s and 40s, and then you don't dip off quite as much as more of a strength sport like the shot put. So marathon is more aerobic versus anaerobic. We'll get into those terms in a second. And then rebounds in basketball, you really kind of have this sweet spot between 20s and 30s, and then you're really going to dip off before 50 years of age. So this is just showing different sports, different abilities, and sort of how and when your peak performance is and why it declines with age. And we're going to get into a lot of those details throughout this class. So one of the reasons why we have this sort of decline in sports performance is due to motor unit remodeling and motor unit recruitment. So when we talk about our central nervous system, and whenever you are younger, it's really good at recruiting motor neurons that then innervate the muscle, that then have an increase in skeletal muscle contraction, reaction time, all of these things that we're good at because of our central nervous system at younger ages. And then as we age, so we're going from kind of young and healthy to aging, we are going to have motor neuron loss, which means we're going to have fewer motor units. And so this is why we can kind of put it with this visual where we have sports performance declining with aging, and we also have sarcopenia, which is also smaller muscles, weaker muscles, reaction time not as great. So that's why it's really important, especially from a strength training side of things, to really build that muscle in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s, and obviously throughout life. But it is kind of one of those things that the more you kind of have in the bank, the better off you'll be. Doesn't mean you can't start strength training at 60, 70, 80 years of age. Yes, that will help. But the earlier that you do, studies show you're going to hold on to that strength and not have so much sarcopenia as you age. So now that we know all of this, we are going to discuss our excitation and contraction coupling, muscular contraction in our next lecture. So thank you. See you soon.